Well, good afternoon, everyone. So we've got 4:01, so let's get kicked off. And welcome to our third Pathways to Decarbonization workshop. The OPPD team is excited to continue the workshop series and interact with our stakeholders around key assumptions and scenarios today. I'm Ryan Stiggy. I'm the program manager for decarbonization. I'm coming into this role after previously working as our lead systems engineer at our North Omaha station. I've been in energy production for the last 7 years, and I'm excited to bring that experience and really work that into our decarbonization initiative and in our future. I've been part of the Pathways to Decarbonization initiative, leading our technology exploration team for the last year, and that team is really eager to share and interact with you today. It's a big part of this workshop today, and we want to show you all the work and research that we've done on candidate technologies and scenarios, as well as we want to hear ideas and feedback from you on things maybe we missed or things we should consider. I'd like to acknowledge with us today members of our OPPD Board of Directors, Director Yoder, Director Spurgeon, and Director Williams. Thank you for joining us. As well as Mary Fisher, our Vice President of Energy Production and Nuclear Decommissioning, and our program sponsor. And thank you to any other elected officials or community leaders that are joining us today, and all the support that you've shown us on this endeavor. As a reminder, this is the third in a progressive series of 6 workshops. If you missed either of the first 2, you can watch them on oppdcommunityconnects.com. And as well, this meeting is being recorded, so you can watch it for viewing later. Tonight, we'll hear from Colton Kennedy, as well as our vendor partner, E3. And I'm going to turn it over to Colton just for a couple things here before we get started.
Yeah, Jeremy. Or sorry, Ryan. Slip up there. So sorry about that. But yeah, to everyone who's joining us, thank you for the feedback that you provided during the last session. We were able to incorporate that in today's session. Should be more interactive. We have a couple periods throughout that we'll be seeking feedback. We're trying to use our interactive tools and have some more open discussion during the meeting. So a lot of content, and we'll try to move through this first part efficiently. Thanks, Ryan.
Thanks, Colton. Let's go on to our next slide. All right, so OPPD has a top priority of safety, and we start all of our meetings with a short safety brief. And today we're looking at electrical safety while working from home. I know there's many of us still there, and this applies to more than just working from home. Some people may be going back to the office and bouncing in between. But a few key things there as you're working from home or transitioning to your office. Avoid overloading outlets. It's easy for us to move things into an area that they aren't normally in, like multiple monitors, coffee pot, and start plugging them in. But just be careful how many things you're putting in your outlets, and check your extension cords. Check them for frays or damage. And also watch where you're running them. You don't want to create a safety hazard by running an extension cord in a walkway for a temporary use. All right, let's move on to the next slide. And I think I'm turning it over to Jamie.
Thank you, Ryan. So this is just a reminder to all of our OPPD and E3 staff to make sure you do mute your microphones when you're not speaking and silence all of your electronic devices. Reminder to our entire audience that this meeting is being recorded, and we will post this recording on OPPD Community Connect when that's available, just in a couple of days or sooner. Public attendees on WebEx are in listen-only mode, and that's to help us keep track of the conversation, but we want to make sure that we hear from you, and we have a variety of ways to do that. If you attended the last session, you might see some of these things as familiar. We're going to be using Poll Everywhere, and we're going to try to use it a little bit differently to keep things engaging today. So make sure you listen to the instructions for engaging in that, and we'll do that in just a second. We have our WebEx Q&A that you can use throughout, and we just ask that these be clarifying questions pertinent to the content that's being covered at that time. That'll help us stay on track, cover the things in a timely manner, and make the most use of your time and keep things straight as far as the flow of the presentation. And then we do have the hand raise feature, and we're going to be looking for that at a couple points throughout the presentation and then at the very end for some open conversation. And you'll get more instructions on how to access that. It's going to be in the bottom right-hand corner of your WebEx screen. You can make use of the hand raise feature whether you're on your computer or on your phone. But again, you'll get some instructions for doing that. First, we're going to go right into one of the Poll Everywhere questions. You can access Poll Everywhere through your phone or a website. If you're on your computer right now, just open up another window. And I'd encourage you to do that with this session of Poll Everywhere, if not for these first few questions, but the last two aren't going to be feasible to use the text because we're looking for a different way for you to engage. So if you want to go ahead and go to pollev.com/OPPD1, we're going to look for your answers in that way. And if you want to use your phone for these first few, that's fine too. You just text OPPD1 to 22333. I'm going to go ahead and jump over there. You get a preview of the question. Okay, so this is the third workshop in our Pathways to Decarbonization Energy Portfolio workshop series. Have you attended or watched the recording of prior workshops? Let us know if you attended the first one on the 7th, if you attended the multi-sector modeling workshop on April 28th, just a couple weeks ago, or if you attended both. And if this is the first, by all means, let us know that and welcome. It's nice to have some repeat attendees, 63%. This is their third in the series, so that's great. All right, thank you for your feedback. Again, we look forward to you engaging with us in this way and then the other ways that we provide as we have multiple touch points throughout. So I'll go ahead and flip it back over. Let's cover the agenda. Colton?
Yeah, thanks, Jamie. So the objective of today is really to share, discuss, and gather feedback on the assumptions and scenarios that we're going to use in our modeling. And so the questions that we'll address today are sort of like what technologies are we going to consider or should we consider in the modeling, or what is the speed of decarbonization that we should study in the modeling process. And so we'll evaluate a range of those, and that'll be sort of the types of questions that we'll cover. Today's presentation, really think of it as two parts. I'll be providing an overview of where this workshop fits into our overall strategic initiative and our workshop series. And then what we're going to do is we're going to dive into some of the details of the key assumptions and the scenarios that were being considered for modeling. And then if you see there's an open comment period, we're allowing sufficient time to have conversation or discussion both after the key assumptions and after the scenarios. And then at the end of the presentation, we'll be able to have some overall comments on your thoughts on how the overall initiative is going and what you'd like to see. As far as the key assumptions, we'll be covering load forecast as well as candidate resources and the existing resources that OPPD has, and then discussing resource and fuel costs, so the costs of technologies that we're assuming in the modeling. And then as far as scenarios, we've broken those up, and you'll see into framing scenarios and then sensitivities to be discussed later in the presentation. And as a reminder to the audience, our charter objective is to study actionable pathways to eliminate or significantly reduce greenhouse gas emissions from OPPD's energy portfolio while balancing impacts on reliability, resiliency, and affordability. A couple of the things that I wanted to re-articulate on that is that it's a study and that we'll be evaluating multiple pathways or a range of options. And so as we go through today, you'll see a lot of different potential scenarios or potential technologies, and we'll be getting input from you on what we should be considering or what types of scenarios that you'd expect to see evaluated and analyzed, and we'll put that together with the teams and work through the modeling process in later workshops. And so as a reminder, the energy portfolio work that we're going to share today is just one project in our overall decarbonization program. The other three projects, there's internal operations, which is focused on developing our overall carbon footprint accounting, and then how OPPD can reduce its emissions for its normal day-to-day operations and business operations. We have customer, that's a project that's focused on how we can develop products and services that might be or encourage them on the customer end to help them individually reduce their carbon impact. The energy portfolio today is focused on the overall grid and generation portfolio. And then the community project is focused on OPPD's role in the community and advocating for partnerships as we develop community-oriented goals and integrate our activities. And so today's workshop, again, key assumptions and scenarios, it's the third in this series of 6 workshops. During the first workshop, we provided an overview of the overall process that we're going to go through, introduced to E3, our vendor, and then discussed sort of at a high level the flow of information. Workshop number 2, we focused on what we call multi-sector modeling. And so that was really developing and understanding that decarbonization is a broader topic than just the electric industry, and that decarbonization across other sectors of the economy has a significant impact on the electric utility and that has an impact on OPPD's future role in the electricity that we'll need to serve. Today's workshop focuses again on those technologies, costs, and the scenarios that we're going to study. The next workshop, workshop number 4, we'll discuss how those inputs are used in our overall modeling framework, specifically how we're optimizing for economics and how we're optimizing to ensure resource adequacy and reliability of the portfolio to meet our objective of serving energy all the time to customers reliably. And then after workshop number 4, the team will go and really use the inputs in the modeling architecture after we've received your input throughout the summer to develop portfolio results. In workshop number 5, we'll come back with what those initial results look like. Portfolio number 6, after we've had some comments on those initial results, we'll share the final results. And then lastly, the results of the decarbonization pathway will be used to inform the integrated resource plan that OPPD will file in February of 2022. Today's workshop, we're striving for the level of involved for the IEP2, or International Association of Public Participation Framework. Already discussed a few of the objectives, but really we want to have time to gain your input on the direction and assumptions that the team is developing as we go through the process. And we're engaging you early in the process as we develop these assumptions to really be able to achieve that level of involved that we're targeting. And so we're at a point where none of these assumptions or technologies are finalized. We're at a point where we're accepting feedback and trying to understand what we should model and how we should model it and gauge your general ideas. You can provide comments in today's meeting and in the open discussion that we have. You can also provide written comment today's content by 5/28. And I do know that there will be individuals that will be interested in the details of specific assumptions. And so for those of you on the call, we'll be releasing a full data release or data packet on the assumptions that we're using to the extent that we can by 6/18. And then we'll request public comment for that by 6/25. So a good amount of time really for feedback on our overall direction based on today's workshop, and then on the details of the assumptions that are going into and scenarios that are going into the modeling. And without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Zach Ming at E3, and we'll talk through some of the key assumptions and then scenarios that we're considering.
Great, thank you, Colton, and hello, everyone. Nice to be with everyone again. You may recognize presented the first two workshops. If you've attended those, I'm Zach Ming, and we also have Arnie Olson and Aaron Burdick from E3 that are on the line today that might be chiming in at various points throughout the presentation or also available to answer any questions. So I think today's workshop is exciting. We're finally getting to the point of the project where we're getting into the some of the substantive issues and decisions that are necessary to be made. So as Colton said, we have a lot of material to present today. We're definitely open to stakeholder feedback, but we wanted to make sure that we, gave stakeholders something very substantive to react to. And so we have a lot of proposals today in terms of what we're proposing to consider, how we're proposing to consider it, what values we're proposing to use. But as Colton said, we're definitely open to feedback, comments, etc. And so there's opportunities to provide that today, as well as written comments and feedback after the end of this workshop. So without further ado, let's go ahead and dive right in to the next slide. As a brief reminder, this initiative, the Energy Portfolio Project that E3 is working with OPPD on, is a multi-phase project. You might recognize this graphic here on the left. This is just a list of each of the major phases or tasks that we will be completing. So workshop number 2 that we had a couple weeks ago was focused on the multi-sector modeling. And today's workshop is focused on some of the key input assumptions and scenarios that are necessary to conduct the middle 3 tasks: the reliability and resiliency analysis task, the portfolio optimization task, and then the risk analysis task. So for key assumptions, we have, there's several, as you'll see. We've bucketed those into 4 major categories. The first being electric loads. So assumptions regarding what is future OPPD electricity demand growth. And that primarily is an output of the multi-sector modeling that we discussed last week in terms of the extent to which other non-electricity sectors decarbonize and to what extent those sectors use electrification as a decarbonization strategy. So those all have significant impacts on electric loads. Existing resources and the treatment and options available to existing resources is a key set of inputs that we'll be discussing, as well as new candidate resource options that OPPD can build or contract for to help reduce carbon emissions. We'll be talking about a lot of the different options that are available for OPPD, the technological state of some of those technologies, the costs, characteristics, and resource potential for some of those technologies. And then finally, resource and fuel costs is an important characteristic of those technologies. Definitely there are uncertainties about what resources may cost in the future, and so we've compiled what we think is supportable, publicly available data for resource costs. And finally, the scenarios portion of the presentation today recognizes that there is significant uncertainty around a lot of the assumptions that we're going to have to make over the next 30 years in terms of what electricity loads are going to be, what resources are going to be available, what those resources are going to cost. And so the scenarios analysis constructs different views of the future of the world and compiles different assumptions together to determine what type of electricity generation portfolio might be optimal given different views of assumptions of the future of the world. And the scenario analysis is directly useful in the risk analysis phase of the project. All right. So to give, again, an overview of how this fits into our workshop process, today's workshop, workshop number 3, we're discussing the key input assumptions and the scenarios as discussed. That feeds, everything we're discussing today feeds directly into what we call the modeling, which is going to be the focus of workshop 4 in 2 weeks. And the modeling is primarily composed of the economic modeling and the reliability modeling. Both of those are necessary to develop resource portfolios that are capable of keeping the lights on reliably, that can meet OPPD's decarbonization goals, and can do so in a way that minimizes costs to OPPD ratepayers. So that will be the focus of workshop 4. And then, as Colton said, we will go away for several months, execute the analysis, and come back sometime towards the end of the year, fall or Q4, with some initial results that will look something like the illustrative graph that you see here on the right, which will have energy portfolios to discuss. Okay, so diving into the first portion of the presentation to discuss key assumptions. Again, just a reminder, we've bucketed this into 4 major categories: load forecast, candidate new resources, existing resources, and resource and fuel costs. So we will dive right in. To discuss the load forecast, this should hopefully look relatively familiar. This was the primary focus of the second workshop on multi-sector modeling, but the load forecast really is a forecast of electricity loads, thinking about to what extent will other non-electricity sectors in the economy decarbonize, and what strategies will those sectors use? Will they rely significantly on electrification as a strategy, or will they rely on other non-electrification strategies like low carbon fuels? So our reference scenario listed here in the top first row of the table is a scenario where we assume essentially current trends in other non-electric sectors. So very little economy-wide decarbonization outside of OPPD. Our moderate decarbonization assumes some moderate levels of greenhouse gas reductions in other non-OPPD sectors. And then we have 3 scenarios that we call our net zero scenarios that assume the entire broader Omaha economy is achieving net zero carbon emissions. And we have 3 different strategies to achieve those net zero carbon emissions. In one bookend case, we have a high fuels scenario, which assumes that we rely significantly on decarbonized fuels and by consequence, to a much lesser extent on electrification. And then on another bookend, we have a scenario where we rely significantly on electrification as the decarbonization strategy. And then in the middle of those, we have what we call the balanced case that relies to a certain extent on electrification, where we view that as being cost effective, and to a certain extent on decarbonized fuels, where electrification may be more difficult or expensive. And so if you translate each of these scenarios into an electricity demand forecast, you can see the chart on the right shows how those stack up against one another. The reference scenario, the blue line on the bottom of the right-hand chart, you can see after some initial industrial load growth over the next 5 years, electricity demand is actually relatively constant through 2050. And that stands in stark contrast to some of the net zero cases, particularly the purple line on top, which is the high electrification scenario, where electricity loads are close to 3 times higher than OPPD electricity loads today. As we discussed 2 weeks ago, it is E3's view that the most feasible or scenario with most potential is probably the net zero balanced scenario. And so that is the scenario that we will propose to focus primarily on in this project, but we also will be assessing the moderate case, which is the green line, the high electrification case, which is the purple line, to assess that as a bookend scenario, and then the reference case as a low end bookend. Again, not to say that the reference case is necessarily likely, but to understand the impacts of some of the other cases relative to the reference scenario. And I will say this chart on the right, it is projection of annual energy load. So these are gigawatt hours across the entire year. But another key planning criteria in the electricity sector is not just annual electricity load, but it's peak electricity demand, the demand during the single highest hour across the entire year. And in fact, if we were to have a chart of peak demand, as we did in the second workshop, you would see that there's significant, particularly for the high electrification scenario, the purple, peak demand is actually significantly higher than the balanced scenario. And so that peak demand impact is one of the primary reasons why we think that the high electrification case is going to be extremely challenging, and why we would propose to focus on the net zero balanced case as the primary scenario we use for our load forecast assumption. Okay, so we have talked a little bit about decarbonization planning and the incredibly important role that energy efficiency plays in achieving carbon reductions, greenhouse gas reductions. And so I do want to talk a little bit about the assumptions that we're making about energy efficiency in this analysis. Obviously, the previous slide shows electricity demand we forecast to be growing quite significantly between now and 2050, which on its face might seem a little bit inconsistent with aggressive assumptions about energy efficiency. But in fact, we are assuming very aggressive assumptions and investments in energy efficiency across the entire economy. So if you look at this chart on the top right, this shows primary energy demand for the broader Omaha economy on a per person basis from now through 2050. And you can see that in our reference scenario, we show that electricity or energy demand is actually relatively constant, maybe declining slightly, and in our net zero scenarios, that energy demand is declining by up to about 30% relative to a reference scenario. And the important distinction here is that this chart is showing energy demand across the entire economy, not just within the energy sector. So the previous slide was showing electricity sector growth. This is showing across the entire economy. So electricity plus transportation plus building energy plus industrial energy. And one of the primary reasons why energy demand is declining in our net zero scenarios is because the electrification of end uses like buildings and cars is actually a very good investment in energy efficiency itself. So for example, electric vehicles are about 3 to 4 times more efficient than gasoline powered cars. And electric heat pumps for building heat are about 3 to 4 times more efficient than natural gas furnaces. And so the electrification of those sectors actually is an energy efficiency strategy and something that decreases overall energy demand across the entire economy. And that is in addition to the standard sort of energy efficiency programs that one might think an electric utility is traditionally involved in. So programs like incentives for more efficient light bulbs, programs related to home energy audits and encouragement of more insulation. All of those things we also are assuming is embedded in the underlying load forecast, and that OPPD is achieving, significant progress on just standard energy efficiency within the electricity sector. So aside from the amount of energy efficiency that we are assuming happens as a base case that is embedded in the electricity demand forecast, we are also proposing to include several additional energy efficiency options as essentially a resource that the modeling will consider side by side with other supply side resources like solar farms, wind farms, etc. And so you can see this chart here on the right, on the bottom right, shows some identified additional potential for energy efficiency and some unspecified potential additional energy efficiency that is derived from the OPPD energy efficiency studies. And we are planning to work with the energy efficiency team at OPPD to characterize these additional incremental energy efficiency programs and essentially make those programs available as a resource option in the modeling for a certain price that the model can select on a side-by-side basis with other supply-side utility scale resources. I will say that while we are planning to evaluate and make these additional incremental energy efficiency and demand response programs available in the modeling, they are going to be relatively generic programs. They're not going to be programs that are targeted at specific customers. We're not getting into that level of detail for this particular portion of the decarbonization project, but there's the customer program within the broader decarbonization initiative. And so that would be the particular place to focus more on the specific energy efficiency and demand response programs and how those would actually be implemented.
Zach, just as a reminder for the audience, if the audience has clarifying questions, they can go ahead and enter those through the Q&A tool and we can get to those even as we're going through the presentation. So if you have those questions that you're seeing on the slide that you'd like clarification on, feel free to use that tool and we'll try to get to you. And then we can, use the conversation points for more broad discussion. Just wanted to make that reminder.
That's right, and we fully expect there to be clarifying questions. So.
Well, we've got a clarifying question we want to ask of our attendees. So we're going to hop back over to Poll Everywhere. Question. Unless you're paying attention, which pathways to decarbonization project will focus on the specific energy efficiency and demand response programs and products? Internal operations, customer, energy portfolio, or community?
Good to see the responses here, Jamie. Yeah, for clarification, what we're doing is we're in the energy portfolio, we're looking, pretty broadly at a pretty high level over a fairly long time horizon. So we really have more macro assumptions for what we can do with energy efficiency. And the details of specific products and programs for energy efficiency are going to be within the customer project. So looks like most respondents got that, and good to see.
All right, so as part of the energy portfolio project, we developed a dedicated team to really explore a universe of technologies that can help us on our transition to net zero carbon. And this team they've spent the last year brainstorming, exploring, and really investigating and researching existing and future technologies. They've spent countless hours working on this, and you can see up to date we've identified over 150 potential technologies, and you can find that on, I believe they were on the OPPD communityconnect.com webpage as a pre-read material. And we recognize that we may not have identified all of them. So if you guys find some that we should investigate or we may have missed, please reach out and submit those either through oppdcommunityconnect.com, or there's going to be some Q&A later. We'd be happy to hear from you there as well. That team, so we really brought a diverse look as part of that team. So we had design and system engineers from our stations. We had members of our alternative energy program, which are really our experts on that advancing and emerging technologies that are coming. We had members from environmental and regulatory affairs, financial services, and our customer services area. So we really brought a diverse background, and the brainstorming sessions were really good, and we spent a lot of time even at conferences and reaching out to vendors to gain more information and learn what's existing today and what's coming in the future. And these technologies are at varying levels of technical feasibility and maturity. So some of them we don't have a lot of data on yet, and they're not really at commercial scale to date. We talk a lot about emerging and new technologies, but we also evaluated a range of options for our existing assets to support this transition. They will be important for us as we move from where we are today into our net zero future. Next slide, please. And so this slide is really a kind of a sample list of those candidate technologies that were identified. They're not all on here. We couldn't fit them all on the slide. You wouldn't be able to read it. But really, this is kind of a testament to all the brainstorming and the research that the team has done. And let's see. And we're really, we want you guys to look at this as well as our list that we provided, and let us know if we've missed anything, and let us know which ones of these are at the top of your list. I think that is good for this one. Just as a reminder, if you see something that's not on there that you think should be or that we missed, please let us know.
And it helps if you talk into your mic. I'll try to do that this time so you can actually hear me. You'll have a chance to give some feedback on that now. So let's shift over. We've got a word cloud for you that we would love to have your help filling out. If you have multiple words, let's say you want to say solar power, you can connect those in the word cloud by using like a tilde, a little curved line, or an underscore. I know a lot of these will be one word answers, but just in case you wanted to connect those, you could do so that way.
Okay, seeing them coming, Jamie. Solar, battery, nuclear, storage seem to be the most prominent that are entered. Efficiency. We'll give it a minute for folks to throw in their ideas. It's interesting to see what what others have on their minds as far as which technologies they think have the most potential. And of course, we'll share through some of the analysis that the team has done as well. But looks like nuclear, solar, battery, storage all coming out as the largest items here.
Might be evening off. Okay. All right, back to you, Ryan.
All right, thank you. So we talked about all these resource or candidate technologies that we've been looking at. In particular, we've been examining a lot of options around our existing resources. They're really a key part of what we do today. They're how we meet our demand today, and they're a key part of our transition to our net zero future. And so we're looking at options to be able to utilize those as part of that transition. And one of those options is to leave them in place as they are today, but the operation may change. So there may be more cycling, there may be lower capacity factors, there could be seasonal operation, they may be more of a resiliency asset. We've also been investigating converting to different fuel sources, and the team really spent a lot of time on this. We've worked with subject matter experts from each of our stations. We've worked with vendors, and this is an important piece we want to make sure that we get a good assessment on, as well as performance and cost estimates for these. But some of those options are to go from coal to natural gas, or to hydrogen, or even a blend of gas and hydrogen. Some of our combustion turbines burn fuel oil, and so we're looking at their ability to burn biofuels. And in the same concept for our combustion turbines, to go from natural gas to hydrogen, or a blend of gas and hydrogen. And a third option is to retire those assets. Co-firing, we talked about coal and gas. So co-firing is really being evaluated as a transition for our coal and gas units to support those greenhouse gas reductions over time. But again, we rely on these assets today. They're critical to our reliability and our resiliency, and they will be the same as we transition to our net zero goal. And so that's why we really want to make sure we're giving them a good look as to what those transition technologies can be. And another note, so I'm talking a lot about our existing assets, but that includes our planned assets as part of Power with Purpose. Those assets really enable us to meet a near-term need, and they also allow that near-term transition for North Omaha units 4 and 5 from coal to natural gas, and they'll be converted after 2023. And the Power with Purpose assets and that plan, that's included in the modeling. Thank you. Next slide, please. We talked a lot about transition technologies for our existing assets, and one that I want to touch on specifically is carbon capture for our coal assets. Carbon capture and sequestration is not going to be considered at this time for our coal assets, and it really comes down to challenges economically, technically, and from an infrastructure standpoint. The costs are significantly higher than alternative technologies. Coal produces higher volumes of CO2 that would need to be sequestered. And you can see in the chart to the right, there's really a lack of geologic formations in our service territory that would make us rely on infrastructure that isn't built out and that we don't have a good feel for at this point. And so for those reasons, we're not looking at carbon capture for our coal units as part of this initial study. We will, however, look at carbon capture for natural gas units. There are different technologies that allow that to be more cost effective. There's lower volumes of CO2 associated with burning natural gas, as well as the capacity factors for those units is lower. But we will continue to monitor developments in the carbon capture technology and the industry as a whole. And if we need to check and adjust in the future, we will do so. Thanks. Next slide.
Okay, looks like we've got another checkpoint for you. Go ahead and chime in, please, with regard to our existing generation assets play a key role in OPPD's future. What fuel conversion options are being considered for existing generation facilities? We've got some options: converting coal to natural gas, converting fuel oil to biofuel, converting coal and natural gas to hydrogen, or D, all of the above.
Jamie, let me know when responses start to level off on your end.
Sure thing.
Yep.
I think we're about there.
Okay, for clarification and sort of what we're doing in the modeling is we're going to consider all of those options. We're going to consider conversion to natural gas and co-firing. We're going to consider a conversion of our fuel oil to biofuel, as well as how we can use hydrogen in the future to power some or all of the generating capacity. So those are all things that'll be considered and evaluated through the modeling process.
All right. Our next question for you. What do you see as the greatest challenge to bringing in new technologies to aid in decarbonization? Would that be availability, maturity, cost, scale, customer adoption, or something else entirely? Got some variation in thoughts here, Colton. There's definitely a front runner.
Yeah, it looks like we're seeing cost as the front runner. Interested that yeah, we're not seeing customer adoption as one. Let's see, maturity, availability, good responses, and I think at least the cost portion, we'll be able to address that and share that through the detailed modeling the team's doing. So that is one area that we'll be able to provide a lot of clarity on. And I think as we talk about technology maturity, we're going to evaluate scenarios that have varying levels of technology maturity as well. So some of those things we'll be able to capture in the range of analysis that we're doing here. So good to see the overall responses. Thank you.
Okay. We're going back to you, Zach.
Okay. So Ryan mentioned that the team has done a lot of work assessing and compiling a really extensive list of different technology options, over 150 options. That is really more options than are feasible to include in a modeling type of analysis. So it was necessary for us to aggregate those technologies into representative groups, compiling, for example, different solar technologies, thin film, crystalline silicon, together into one representative solar resource. And the same for other resources like wind, energy storage, recognizing there are several different flavors of energy storage that have different durations and characteristics. But where we felt resources were similar to each other from the core characteristics and potential that they could provide to the system, we've aggregated those into representative groups. And you can see that represented here at the top of this slide. There were some technologies that we did exclude for a lack of potential reasons. So for example, hydro for electricity generation is something that we are excluding for reasons due to lack of potential. Not to say that hydro is not a well-established, mature generation technology with well-known costs, but Nebraska in particular, like many places across the US, does have hydro resources, but not very significant potential incremental new hydro resources. Most of the best places to build dams in Nebraska have already been developed, and so we would be excluding resources like hydro or pumped hydro analysis. For every resource that passes the feasibility screen and we lump into a representative group, we then categorize it by maturity level. So a resource we categorize as either being mature, we categorize it as either being an emerging technology or an experimental technology. And we'll get into on the next slide exactly what each of those maturity levels means and why we've decided to categorize different resources at each of those levels. But it would then be our proposal to take those representative technologies and run different scenario analyses to assess optimal energy portfolios, assuming different combinations of technologies being available for the model to select. So we know mature technologies exist today. We know their costs, they're very well established. We definitely want to run a scenario where we limit the model to only selecting mature technologies, but we also want to run scenarios that include emerging technologies, thinking if these technologies do become developed and costs do become competitive, then if these technologies were to become available, how might those emerging technologies be able to help OPPD achieve its carbon reduction targets? And it would fully be our expectation that the more resources we make available to the model, the easier and more economic decarbonization is going to be. So if you limit yourself to only mature technologies, it may or may not be feasible to achieve decarbonization, but if we make mature and emerging technologies available, then that would certainly give the model more options and make it more economic to achieve decarbonization. And we'll talk a little bit towards the end of the presentation about those scenarios and what our proposals are for those to get feedback and input on that. So if we go to the next slide, to talk a little bit about this maturity screening level. We are relying on information published by the International Energy Administration, the IEA. They published something called the Technology Readiness Level, or TRL, index that we use to score different technologies. So you can see here what the characteristics, according to the IEA, are for a mature technology, an emerging technology, and an experimental technology. A mature technology is a technology that has significant commercial history. It has well-documented cost data, potential data, performance characteristics data, and there has been a lot of development of this resource. So mature technologies would include things like solar, wind, battery storage, and traditional generation assets like combustion turbines, combined cycle units, etc. For emerging technologies, these would be resources that may have some small scale or limited development history. Maybe they've succeeded in pilot projects. There's some data about their cost and performance characteristics, but the resources has not been scaled commercially to a large extent, and there's still significant uncertainty about how the cost of this resource might evolve over time into the future, how much the cost may decline as this resource scales up and the industry learns how to improve this resource. So example, emerging technologies would be things like carbon capture and sequestration, small modular nuclear, hydrogen, or even something called direct air capture, which is a form of negative emission technology that essentially removes carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And then finally, an experimental technology would be a type of technology that exists, at the very least in theory, potentially in a lab, but has not really been proven in any way in the field or in a commercially viable way. So there's not been any significant development to speak of. The costs are usually highly theoretical. The performance characteristics are highly uncertain. And so this would be something like, for example, ultra long duration storage, which is similar to battery storage, but instead of being able to generate for hours, ultra long duration storage may be able to generate for days or weeks. But these types of technologies are highly uncertain. So our proposal would be to include mature technologies in all of our scenarios, include emerging technologies to a limited extent in some of our scenarios, and exclude certain experimental technologies that we do not think are feasible or likely, or that we should be planning on coming available in terms of making decarbonization plans. Okay, so if we kind of take everything we've talked about from the 150 different technology options that we've rolled up into representative buckets, you can see here in the second column a list of each of those representative technology buckets that we're planning to incorporate in the modeling. So we have categorized each of these technologies. You can see here we have a utility scale renewable energy category. There's 5 different renewable energy technologies. We have a distributed energy resource category, 5 different resources that customers might be able to invest in, energy efficiency, rooftop solar, etc. We have a conventional generating technologies category. So these are resources that have a long history and use in the electricity sector. So things like natural gas plants. We have an energy storage category that has different types of energy storage. Each of these representative buckets we think are significantly different from one another, that they warrant inclusion in the modeling as their own representative technology bucket. So we have 4 different flavors of energy storage. And then we have an emerging technologies bucket with 3 different emerging technologies that we think have potential promise, and that we should evaluate how the future availability of these technologies might impact OPPD's pathway to net zero. And then finally, we have a negative emissions technology bucket or an offsets bucket. This is not really a generation technology category. This is a category of technologies that can remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and can be used to offset any remaining emissions from OPPD's generation portfolio. And so that would be technologies like direct air capture. So definitely encourage you to review this list of technologies, and this is ultimately what will be feeding into the model, and we'll be releasing data on these technologies in terms of their costs, but we definitely want to ensure that the list of technologies that we've included here fully encompasses the types of technologies that stakeholders want to make sure we're including.
Zach, let's go ahead and pause here for a second, just for folks to absorb the list, and we'll talk through those mature and emerging technologies in a little bit more detail, but just so folks can take a look through the list. And there was a question earlier that we received in the Q&A around our use of hydrogen, what the source of it, and whether it's green hydrogen. And from a modeling perspective, we're considering green hydrogen, and we're going to share some of the cost forecasts for that green hydrogen in some upcoming slides. But just wanted to respond to that question verbally. And then one more question I'd like to prompt. In the last slide, we listed ultra long duration storage as theoretical, and here we have it as emerging. I agree that it would be good to include in emerging, but you confirm it being included just around the idea of ultra long duration storage. I know that there are many types of long duration storage specific technologies, and so that's probably where the classification could be more clear.
Yeah, I think we are planning to include ultra long duration, or categorize at least some types of ultra long duration storage as an emerging technology. So there may be some experimental technologies, and I think that's what was included in the previous table, but we are planning to include it as an emerging technology that will be considered in some scenarios. And so that's what's represented here. So yeah, thanks for that clarification.
Great, and I think we could move forward. Thank you.
Okay. All right. So in the list of different technology options that we just showed, I think we fully expect some of those technology options before we even conduct the analysis. We fully expect some of those technologies to play a starring role. I don't think it's surprising to anyone that wind and solar are very likely going to be a workhorse in helping OPPD to reduce carbon emissions. Very fortunate that Nebraska has a really good wind resource, number 4 in the nation, and a really good solar resource as well, number 13 in the nation. And so we'll be relying on data from the National Renewable Energy Laboratory about what the potential for these resources are in Nebraska, as well as surrounding states, what the wind generation and solar generation profiles look like. We also fully expect that energy storage is also going to play an important role. Clearly, wind and solar produce energy when the wind is blowing and the sun is shining, which is not necessarily exactly aligned with when customers are consuming or demanding electricity. And so using energy storage as a way to shift wind and solar production around on a daily basis or slightly longer basis is very important to actually delivering that renewable energy. And then finally, relying on mature technologies like low carbon dispatchable resources, like combustion turbines, for example. We also expect to be potentially important in helping ensure grid reliability during extreme conditions or periods of prolonged low wind generation or prolonged low solar generation. So we do expect, mature technologies to play a very important role in decarbonization. We do think, if you go to the next slide, however, that there is somewhat of an emerging consensus across the industry that while existing mature technologies like wind, solar, and battery storage get a very, very long way to reducing carbon emissions, that it may very well be likely that a breakthrough technology in the emerging technology category will be necessary to get all the way to net zero or to completely eliminate carbon emissions from the electricity sector. And so that's why we are proposing to model emerging technologies. You can see 5 of the emerging technologies that we're proposing to model in this study. Without getting into an incredible amount of detail on each of these, I'll just talk briefly about them. So we have hydrogen. Hydrogen, really, we are going to treat as a substitute for natural gas. Hydrogen is a gaseous fuel, can be used in traditional generating plants like combustion turbines as a substitute for natural gas. And therefore, it would be able to provide a lot of the same characteristics as a traditional dispatchable unit. You can turn it on when you need it, run it for as long as you need, and it's available when other resources might not be available. It's not subject to the same sort of Mother Nature weather patterns as other renewable resources. Long duration storage is another resource that we want to consider. So again, these would be resources that, unlike battery storage, that might have a capability to dispatch for hours. Long duration storage might be able to dispatch for multiple days or even weeks and really shift renewable energy instead of just from the middle of the day to the night, but shift renewable energy across seasons, which could be very important to achieve decarbonization, accounting for the seasonal patterns of renewable generation. Carbon capture and sequestration, Ryan talked about that, but we are planning to include carbon capture and sequestration as an option for natural gas, not for coal, and Ryan talked about some of the reasons for that. Still a lot of uncertainty about costs of this resource, but we're planning to include it in the modeling and see how it compares to some of the other resources. Advanced nuclear, or what some people call small modular reactors, or SMRs, is a technology that we're planning on including. These types of resources, there's a lot of research and development that is going into advanced nuclear right now. Not a ton of commercial experience and development with these types of resources, but I think there's a lot of theoretical promise and potential for these resources. There are some political hurdles with any type of nuclear, and that's something that we're cognizant and aware of, but it is something that we're planning to include in the emerging technologies bucket. And then finally, direct air capture. Again, this is not a generation technology, but it's a technology that actually consumes energy and is able to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and then ultimately store or sequester that carbon dioxide underground geologically in a very permanent way to ensure that that carbon dioxide is not re-released into the atmosphere. And so obviously that doesn't provide electricity generation, but there is a cost to building and operating these resources. And so we would assume, something like $200 to $250 per ton of sequestered carbon from direct air capture you can see at the bottom right-hand side of the slide. So we do, the modeling will provide us insights on to what extent these emerging technologies are necessary to achieve net zero carbon. The modeling will provide us insight on to what extent these technologies become available, to what extent they're able to reduce the cost of decarbonization relative to having to rely on only today's mature technologies. And then the other thing, we'll talk about this when we get to the scenarios, but we are planning to run a scenario where we just assume that hydrogen is the only emerging technology that becomes available. It is our team's view that hydrogen is very likely the most promising of the emerging technologies that you see listed here for a couple of reasons. Number one, the actual fundamental underlying technology of hydrogen is very well established. There's not a whole lot of additional research and development that needs to happen. We can take hydrogen and we can use it today in certain types of traditional generating plants that are equipped to handle it. There are questions about the availability and cost of hydrogen, but the fundamental underlying technology is actually relatively well established. And the other aspect of hydrogen is that we don't necessarily see there being a significant amount of political barriers for hydrogen in the same way that we might expect to be the case for emerging technologies like carbon capture and sequestration or small modular nuclear reactors. So we do plan to look at hydrogen as a special case that we'll discuss in some of our scenarios.
Zach, we had a couple of clarifying questions as we're going through that I wanted to bring up. One was around small modular reactors, the fact that they've been available, in the nuclear fleet for some time, on submarines, and so why are they considered as emerging here? And the second question is going back to the comments that you made on biomass. Why aren't we considering biomass as a generation technology?
Yeah, both good questions. So for small modular reactors, while they have been available for a long time in certain applications, they have not been available to the power sector, and they don't have a lot of commercial history in the power sector. And in the certain niche applications that they are used, they're extremely expensive. And so more what we're talking about here is there the potential to really scale up small modular reactors as an industry and drive down those costs to competitive levels where they can compete with not only other potential emerging technologies like hydrogen, but with mature technologies. And so I think that's where a lot of the uncertainty is in creating the manufacturing scale and low commercial costs that would be necessary to scale up this resource. For biomass, good observation on the previous slide. Biomass, that we actually do think that biomass is there is biomass in Nebraska, and so we want to acknowledge that. But we also want to acknowledge that there is a limited quantity of biomass, and without converting additional land that today might be used for food to specifically having purpose-grown crops that could be used for biomass, there is just a limited quantity of biomass. And we think that biomass may very likely be most economically used in other sectors of the economy that are not electricity generation. And so we wouldn't want to assume that electricity generation is sort of taking its unfair share of that resource from other sectors of the economy. And so that is the primary reason why we would be proposing to not include biomass as a feasible option in the modeling.
One more clarifying question here before we continue. It's around demand and load flexibility being considered an emerging technology. An example, EVs are extremely flexible in when they can charge. Comments on that?
Yeah, so I think we are planning to include, there's a lot of verse to load flexibility. So I don't want to necessarily broad brush say that, the uncertainty of load flexibility is on par with the uncertainty of direct air capture. We are certainly planning to assume a certain level of load flexibility, for example, around electric vehicle charging. I think where it starts to get a little more unclear is to what extent can the utility rely on electric vehicles to discharge back to the grid. It's one thing to say, please charge your cars in the middle of the day when we have a great solar resource outside, instead of charging your car when you get home at 7 p.m. It's another thing to say, please charge your car in the middle of the day and discharge your car at 7 p.m. back to the grid so you can help meet peak electricity demand. And I think the uncertainty is around consumer behavior, around costs, around the willingness of car manufacturers to agree to a type of construct like that, even though it might be technically feasible. And so we are planning to assume certain levels of load flexibility to a certain extent, but we're not necessarily planning to assume as a base case sort of anything that's technically feasible from a load flexibility perspective.
Thanks for that, Zach. And I think we can keep on moving forward considering time and the rest of the content that we have.
Sounds good. Okay, so this slide right here is covering technology and fuel cost projections. So this is, as probably everyone on this call is aware, one of the most important assumptions that we will be making in this project. And we fully recognize that there is a lot of uncertainty about what technologies are going to cost and what fuels are going to cost between today and 2050. Particularly for many zero carbon resources that are still scaling as an industry, where the technology is still improving, where the industry is still gathering a significant amount of learning, we expect all of those factors to contribute to cost declines as those resources scale. And you can see in the charts here on the left, for different resources, we have fixed costs of some resources in the top chart, a levelized cost of energy for some different resources in the bottom chart. You can see for some of the less mature technologies, but still mature technologies, that we're forecasting cost declines. For some of the more established technologies, you can see that the costs are more established and relatively constant. The data here that you see in these charts is publicly available data from the National Renewable Energy Laboratory. They published a report called the Annual Technology Baseline Report, and that is the source that we're relying on, that we plan to rely on for our cost data. And so we will be releasing a spreadsheet of this data on June 18th, as you can see here in the orange box on the bottom right. And subject to stakeholder feedback, we'll be releasing this data in a spreadsheet and allowing stakeholders to further comment on that data. I will say, so as our base case, we are planning to assume that technologies, renewable technologies, zero carbon resources experience declining costs, particularly in the near term, but between now and 2050. We are also planning to run a sensitivity analysis where we assume even steeper cost reductions than what you see in these charts here. And we call that our breakthrough cost sensitivity. So it assumes breakthrough cost reductions above and beyond the levels that you see here. And we will be gathering insights and assessments about how that affects the ability to achieve net zero carbon, or at least the cost of achieving net zero carbon. The one thing I will say about costs, while the costs here, it seems like you might be able to directly compare resources to one another, at the bottom chart saying, oh, the cost of solar is this, the cost of this, the cost of gas is this. I would just remind everyone that these are the cost of the resource, but it doesn't necessarily capture the characteristics of these resources. So the characteristics of wind are quite different from the characteristics of solar. They generate at different times of day, they have different seasonal patterns, and the same for gas. Gas is able to generate at any time of day, whereas solar has different generation characteristics. And so what our modeling will be doing, that we'll be discussing in more detail in 2 weeks, is combining not only the cost of these resources, but the characteristics of these resources as well, holistically, to ensure that we're producing a portfolio that is able to, in the aggregate, achieve reliability and zero net carbon at the lowest total cost. And you can see here, this chart on the right shows fuel price forecasts. We have 3 different fuel types we're going to be evaluating: coal, that's the black lines on bottom; natural gas, that's the gray lines in the middle; and then hydrogen, which are the green lines on top. And again, to answer a question, we are assuming that this hydrogen is green hydrogen, which means it would be produced from renewable energy, essentially cracking water in half with renewable energy to create hydrogen and then oxygen as a byproduct. And so these are the assumptions about hydrogen, and we have some pretty steep projections of hydrogen cost declines as different aspects of the hydrogen production process improve. Okay.
Okay, so I think the team has been trying to keep up with your questions on the Q&A, and I think they've probably been doing a pretty fantastic job. But we promise to also allow some hand raise for you to verbalize your questions. This can be whether you are on the computer or on your phone. You can use the hand raise button that's in the lower right by the attendees icon. Just scroll to the bottom of the attendee list and click the hand raise button. Then just make sure you click it again to lower it once you've been addressed, please. And then telephone users, if you have not logged in via your computer, but you still have a question, you can hit *3, and that both raises and lowers your hand. So I think I'll probably ask for some help from my colleagues, Sarah or Kim, if you guys are able to identify any hand raises, and then we can see who has a question, and we'll try to keep up with those in the order that they go up, guys.
I don't see any hand raises just yet, but let's give people a minute to find the hand raise button and see if we have any questions.
I think there may be one.
Yes, there is. And I will apologize if I say the name wrong, but John, we have John has his hand raised.
Yeah.
Kim, if you could
Thank
unmute.
you, John Romankowitz from Sierra Club. I was wondering, for the fuel price forecast, is there any risk that, in the future, as the demand for natural gas falls due to climate action, that, the price, really stays flat or even declines?
Yeah, I can take a stab at that, Zach, and then maybe you can provide a little bit more of the modeling detail. We're going to evaluate a range of natural gas prices when we come out of and develop the portfolios, and then conduct a risk analysis around the potential portfolio costs. But I think, heard a lot of news around, is it going to go up? Is it going to go down? We're just using the EIA baseline projections at this point.
Yeah, I totally agree with what Colton said about the uncertainty of natural gas prices. I think the only thing we know is that the future prices are not going to be what's in our projection chart. We can say that with certainty. I think historically, fuel price sensitivity has been probably the most important sensitivity that a utility does in assessing the risk of a portfolio. I think as we move towards a decarbonized portfolio, I think one of the interesting things is that the impact of fuel prices and the uncertainty of fuel prices just becomes a lot less significant because there's going to be a lot less fuel use. The majority of electricity is going to come from renewable resources and other resources that don't have fuel costs. And so while we do know there's going to be uncertainty in the gas price, it is not as significant as historically has been.
Thank you.
And then, John, if you don't mind just lowering your hand, unless you have another question, you can certainly raise your hand again. But I do see another question. If we could unmute Andy Knott, please.
Hi, thanks. Andy Knott with Sierra Club also. When you are doing analyses of the different gas options, will you be looking at the sort of entire life cycle and upstream climate impacts from methane? Because methane is a very potent greenhouse gas, and it goes beyond just the carbon impacts of burning it, but just the leakage from the gas system.
Yeah, I can take a shot at that. So I think we are planning to look at life cycle impacts. I don't know that we'll necessarily be including that in the modeling, but certainly we are planning to look at that, and whether that's a post-processing action where we layer on those effects. Again, the entire project is really focused around how can we reduce carbon emissions, which means reducing fossil fuels of all types is the primary vehicle to reducing those emissions. So as the quantity of fuel decreases, then obviously the upstream impacts of those fuels are going to decrease as well and would hopefully become less significant. So we are planning to look at that, but I don't know that we're planning to include that directly in the modeling.
The other thing I would caveat there, Zach, is the availability of information on all of the upstream contributions. I think to the extent that we can post-process and sort of qualitatively, or to the extent that the information is available, I think we can do that. But the optimization, as Zach said, is really to meet net zero carbon by 2050, and so that's going to be primarily driven through minimization of fossil fuels. So I would expect a similar outcome in many cases without it being explicitly modeled.
It doesn't look like we have any other hand raises at this point. I know that there will be additional times to ask questions later on within the presentation. And of course, continue to send us the clarifying questions through the Q&A. But at this point, I think we could probably move on.
Great. So thanks for your questions on the technologies and assumptions. We're going to jump into scenarios now, and there'll be more pull everywhere. And I'll give you instructions, and I can remind you of that website then, as well as Sarah mentioned, the Q&A. So.
Okay. So we just wrapped up the assumptions portion of the presentation, talking about those 4 buckets of assumptions, and now moving into the scenarios portion, where talk about how do we package and mix and match those assumptions to create different future scenarios of the world to analyze. So if we go to the next slide, one important decision that's necessary to execute the modeling is an assumption around the pace of decarbonization. So we know that OPPD has set a net zero by 2050 target. There is not necessarily clear goals around the pace with which that goal is achieved. So we plan to, as a base case, assess reductions between now and 2050 in a relatively linear or constant way. You can see that dark blue line showing reductions between 2018 and 2050 as a base case, or what we call our straight line case. And then we also plan to look at two sensitivities where we assess an accelerated pace, essentially earlier, faster carbon reductions, still achieving net zero by 2050, and then what we call a moderated pace, where emissions are reduced in a slightly moderated way, but also achieving net zero by 2050. Both of those, all three of those scenarios would be compared to a reference GHG case, where we assume no greenhouse gas reductions. That's the gray line at the top. And again, recognizing that the reference case is by no means OPPD's policy or what we expect a plausible outcome to be, but we would be running that case so that we can compare the various net zero cases to that reference case to assess the potential cost impacts or other impacts of these decarbonization scenarios. And then we also plan to run a net zero by 2035 scenario that's the green line that you see here, to understand the impacts of recognizing that this is not OPPD's policy, but running a case where there's accelerated achievement of net zero carbon to understand what the cost impacts of that type of a scenario and feasibility of that type of a scenario might be. Okay, so you can see here, if we take the combination of those different greenhouse gas reduction trajectories that we just looked at on the previous slide, if we take a combination of those scenarios and combine them with different combinations of technology availability that we've already discussed, we've created a set of what we call our framing scenarios. And these are just different combinations of greenhouse gas reduction targets and technology availability to help understand different pathways to decarbonization under various future states of the world. Faster or slower carbon reduction trajectories, and assessing if different emerging technologies become available in ways that they might not fully be today. Everything will be run relative to a reference scenario. That's the top line of this chart here, or this table here. Again, the reference scenario would assume no mandated greenhouse gas reductions, which would just be to establish a baseline against which every other scenario can be measured. So you can see here the list of greenhouse gas targets that we will be running would be a net zero by 2050 for a straight line case, an accelerated pace, and a moderated pace. And then you can see the net zero by 2035 scenario that we've already discussed to understand the cost and feasibility implications of that, as well as an absolute zero by 2050 case. What this means is that our net zero cases don't necessarily require that all carbon emissions are eliminated from the OPPD generation portfolio, but that any remaining on the system would be needed to be offset in some way of what we're assuming is a negative emission technology, such as direct air capture. Absolute zero means that negative emission technologies are not available, and that the OPPD generation fleet would need to completely eliminate all carbon emissions. And so we do expect this is a more stringent, more difficult, more costly greenhouse gas target than a net zero case. And then finally, we're also planning to examine several different near zero cases. So 80% carbon reductions, 90%, 95% carbon reductions. Again, these are very deep levels of decarbonization, but are not consistent necessarily with OPPD's net zero carbon goals. And we would just be running these scenarios to understand the cost impacts and feasibility impacts of each sort of incremental tranche of decarbonization to understand how the costs increase at each point along the curve. And for each of those GHG target scenarios, we would propose to run 3 different technology availability scenarios, a mature only scenario where we only rely on technologies that we know are completely commercially available today. That's our mature bucket that we've already discussed. And then we would propose to run some scenarios where we make emerging technologies available. In one case where we only make hydrogen available as an emerging technology, and then another case where we make all of the other emerging technologies that we've previously listed available. So that would be not only hydrogen, but also carbon capture and sequestration, long duration storage, and small modular nuclear. And we fully expect that the more types of resources that are available, the easier and cheaper decarbonization will be. I mean, that's just kind of a core tenet of these types of analyses, that the more options are available, the more options the model has to choose from, and that the easier and more economic decarbonization is. But that comes with the risk that some of these technologies might not become available in ways that we would be projecting, which is why we would also be running more limited cases of future technology availability. Okay.
Okay, so given those framing scenarios that Zach just talked about, folks, we would really like your input once again. This time, I'm going to want you to go just to the website if you're not already there. The texting portion of Poll Everywhere doesn't support this question, but we thought it was worth having you be at pollev.com/OPPD1 to make sure that you can participate. So we'd like to know which framing scenario you're most interested in seeing results for. And you can just click and drop a pin, up to 3 per person. And this will help us get a better idea of where your interest lies. Again, it's pollev.com/OPPD1. And we'll use the site for the last question as well that's coming up. Probably close to leveling off, Colton, maybe a few others here and there.
Yeah, I see a couple more pin drops that are being added, but yeah, this is good information as we go back and really work to develop the scenarios, is knowing which scenarios stakeholders are most interested in seeing. So we'll pair this with the team's judgment and stakeholder feedback to come up with the list, and ultimately we'll be publishing out that list in the data release next month. So great feedback, thank you.
Okay. So we've discussed that there are a number of uncertainties around some of the assumptions that we're going to be making. 2 of those dimensions of uncertainty are around both the pace of decarbonization and technology availability, which we just discussed as the 2 dimensions of our framing scenarios. There are a number of other inputs and assumptions that we want to test the sensitivity to of different inputs. The first of those is multi-sector electrification. So this assumption is really regarding what is future OPPD electricity demand going to be. We would propose that our base case focus on the net zero balanced scenario, but that we would also look at bookend cases of high electrification, which is the highest load growth, including extremely high growth in peak demand, as well as the moderate case and the reference load case, the reference load case being the low bookend for electricity load growth. And no surprise, but the higher electricity loads are, the more resources that are required. That's not surprising. I think we'd be looking for insights in this sensitivity around how does it change the composition of the portfolio, or what types of near-term decisions might differ depending on what future electricity loads are. We would also propose to look at assumptions around technology costs. So as discussed, our baseline technology cost forecast assumes a baseline level of cost reductions for renewable technologies like wind, solar, and battery storage. And we would also propose to look at a breakthrough reductions case where we assume even lower costs than what we're assuming in our baseline case. I will say that, OPPD already has a goal to reduce carbon emissions, and so we know that new resources, particularly renewable resources, are going to be necessary to achieve those emission reductions. So it's not necessarily the case that lower renewable costs will lead to more renewable energy, because the renewable energy is necessary to get built to achieve carbon reduction. The cost will definitely impact the cost of achieving those reductions, but it won't necessarily impact the actual level of build out of renewable resources or carbon emission reductions. There could be some impacts there, but that's certainly something that we'd be looking to the modeling to tell us, and something that we'd be looking to learn from this study. There's also uncertainty around carbon policy. You can see the third row here in this sensitivity scenario assumptions. Right now, OPPD's carbon goal is, a goal they've set for themselves, not driven by Nebraska state policy or federal policy. And so as a base case, we would be assuming no carbon policy and that all emission reductions would be driven by internal goals. But as a sensitivity case, we would want to understand if there were some type of government policy, such as a carbon price or a carbon tax, how would that interplay with OPPD's own goals? Would it, potentially accelerate or change the type of resources that are getting built to achieve net zero carbon? And so we would be proposed to run a carbon price, or otherwise known as a carbon tax scenario. And then finally, we are proposing to look at a relatively in the weeds assumption regarding greenhouse gas import and export accounting. And this assumption is really related to the fact that OPPD is a member of the Southwest Power Pool electricity market, which is a huge electricity market that spans most of the middle of the US. And as a member of that market, they participate in buying and selling electricity from other utilities in the area. And so what this assumption or this decision would look at is, what are the carbon or greenhouse gas implications of buying and selling electricity with or from other members in the Southwest Power Pool? So as a base case assumption, we would propose to assume that when OPPD is buying electricity from the Southwest Power Pool market, that there is carbon embedded in that electricity that would count towards OPPD's carbon emissions. And when they sell electricity to the market, that assumes that other people are ramping down their carbon emitting generation to buy OPPD's generation. And so that would result in a carbon credit that accrues to OPPD. And that carbon credit could be used to offset OPPD's own carbon emissions. As a sensitivity case, we would propose to assume that there is still a carbon penalty for purchasing electricity from the Southwest Power Pool market, but when OPPD sells electricity to the Southwest Power Pool market, that there is no carbon credit for selling electricity. And so that carbon credit couldn't be used to offset OPPD's other emission generation. So this is a complex assumption, and it has a lot to do with accounting conventions. Ultimately, it's grounded in the fact that we want to make sure that carbon dioxide is fairly accounted for among all market participants, that every carbon emission ton can be attributed to someone in the Southwest Power Pool market, and that we're accurately and fairly assigning those carbon dioxide emissions. And so these are two perspectives of how to look at that, and that's what we're proposing sort of as a base case as well as a sensitivity case. But again, I think this all of these different sensitivity assumptions we are open to stakeholder feedback and comments on.
And on that note, we talked framing scenarios. Now we'd like to get some feedback on the sensitivities that you're most interested in. Again, it's pollev.com/OPPD1. Here's a snapshot of what we did last question. Similarly, if you could drop a pin, looking for your interest in the sensitivities that you'd like to see evaluated.
And of course, if participants have thoughts on other sensitivities, they can always submit those to the team for consideration. We've put together the sensitivities that we thought might be appropriate, and definitely appreciate the input and preferences of what stakeholders would like to see. So, thank you. The best we can do without posting stickies on a whiteboard. So, I appreciate everyone coming along with us.
It's our virtual sticky notes and a whiteboard. While those are coming in, we'll give attendees a heads up that our next slide will be another open discussion to talk in more detail if anyone has any thoughts on those framing scenarios and modeling sensitivities.
I'm seeing quite a few pins on the net zero high electrification case, and I guess just to differentiate that, the net zero balance, the net zero high electrification case both achieve net zero across the broader economy. It's just in how they do that. One with more reliance on or net zero carbon fuels, and one really pushing all of the load to the electric sector. Even for those high winter peak heating loads. So both of those achieve net zero across the economy.
Any last pins? Maybe one or two, but I'll jump back over to the presentation and we can open it up for the discussion if you'd like, fellows. Once again, you've got your hand raise options. Please do let us know if you have a question. We'd love to unmute you. Use the hand raise button at the bottom of the attendees icon down in the bottom right hand corner, and then *3 if you're only on the phone to raise and lower.
While we're waiting for hand raises, Zach, we had one question. I think it was kind of related to the overall modeling around aren't all or most utilities pursuing some form of the same strategy around decarbonization? And I think that the question is probably around what's the impact and how are we accounting for that with our broader modeling?
Yeah, there's a couple ways that we're planning to account for that. So I guess broadly, we are planning to assume that the rest of the Southwest Power Pool market is also seeing the same trends, subject to the same potential policy forces as OPPD. And so we are planning to include in the modeling a very significant transformation of Southwest Power Pool resources towards renewable energy and energy storage. And so the market that we will be modeling that OPPD is trading with, we will be modeling it as a market that is full of renewable energy, and that will impact some of the dynamics with which OPPD is trading in the market. I will say that while OPPD is a member of a market, there is good utility practice and standard risk mitigation measures that utilities still like to be relatively self-sufficient and not too dependent on the market in any given direction, not too dependent on buying from the market or selling to the market, which could expose customers to significant rate impacts if prices end up different than expected. And so we will be planning to model OPPD as having a relatively self-sufficient energy portfolio, where trading with the SPP market is limited to a moderate amount. And we'll be constructing a resource portfolio that can achieve that. And The final way, and that I think we're capturing the evolution of the rest of the Southwest Power Pool market, is through that assumption on buying and selling with the market and what the carbon implications of that are. In our base case, we are assuming that the rest of the Southwest Power Pool market, that when OPPD sells electricity to the market, that there's a carbon benefit or credit associated with that. But if the rest of the market is carbon-free, then selling carbon-free energy doesn't necessarily save carbon if it's not backing down someone else's carbon-emitting generator. And so that's why we're planning to run a sensitivity on that specific assumption to understand how that might change the total cost of decarbonization portfolio.
Thanks, Zach. Jamie, do we have any hands raised?
Colton, it doesn't look like we do. I was just checking, unless I missed any, but it doesn't look like anyone has their hands raised right now.
Okay, thanks, Sarah. There's also a question around how we're looking at total costs and whether we would proceed with a portfolio at any cost, regardless of what it is. I guess just as a response, we're conducting the study to see what decarbonization costs across a range of different speeds, and considering a range of different technologies. So the cost will be an outcome of this, and it will inform OPPD's direction certainly. But it is just a study around what the potential costs will be.
Okay, it looks like we can go through the next couple slides and we'll talk about upcoming workshops and next steps, but there'll be another option for those hand raises too if we approach any.
Okay. Yeah, so we'll have more general discussion here at the end, but something that we did want to share is that, or remind participants of, is just that we will be providing this information out in a data release. The team is still aggregating that, and we did want to get in front of you as we were sort of at the framing level. And so definitely your comments now are appreciated. 4.5.28 are appreciated as we assemble that set of data. But then there will also be a period for written comments after we publish the data on 6/18 and before 6/25. So we certainly welcome comments. And then the next workshop that we'll be having is workshop number 4. There were several questions that came up in the chat around how are we modeling, what sort of time and megawatt resolution, how are we considering effective load carrying capability, a fun topic that we'll be getting into workshop number 4. So all of that, we're going to address in detail in workshop number 4 and support any questions that you may have. That's on May 26th. And that will be our last workshop before the team goes off and conducts some of the detailed modeling and comes back in the fall with some of the initial results.
Okay. Sarah, do you want to talk about next steps?
Yes, I'll be happy to. We are committed to continued stakeholder engagement and feedback. For those of you that attended this workshop, if you still have feedback for us, there's going to be plenty of time to be able to do that. So I'm just going to walk you through just a couple of things that we're going to be asking for. After this, we will be sending you a survey. We'd love to get your feedback of your thoughts on this meeting. There will be a pop-up option as we close off this meeting for you to complete that survey, and also watch for your email. We'll love your input there. Our next workshop is in just 2 weeks from today, 4 to 6 p.m. Join us for workshop 4. However, if you still have feedback or you have, I mean, we went through a lot of information during this meeting. We will be placing a recording of this meeting on the website by Friday, if not before. We'll also have the PowerPoint of this meeting if you wanted to review that. And we will be accepting comments and questions from the content that was covered in this meeting. We realize it is so much that we're extending our comment period for 2 weeks rather than the usual 1 week that we have had for these workshops. So please know that there's going to be room for you to place comments on OPPD Community Connect and also questions and answers on that platform. The way you find that is when you go to oppdcommunityconnect.com, there is a page that you could find there right on the homepage that is for Pathways Decarbonization workshops. The first thing that you'll see when you get to that workshop page would be how you register, and that's how you could register for May 26th. But there's also a button on there where it can take you to another page where we have all of our recordings posted, as well as that place for additional comments and questions. So again, we're taking that for a few weeks after, or for a couple weeks, I'm sorry, after this workshop. All those dates will be included there on the website, and we'll very much look forward to hearing additional feedback from you from this workshop. Additionally, if you are interested in having one of our speakers come out to your organization or business to talk more about Pathways Decarbonization, please visit oppd.com/speakersbureau, and we can set up something for you to have a special guest speaker from OPPD come to your event.
Thank you, Sarah. Please don't hesitate to give us feedback in all of the places and opportunities that you have to do so. We do make improvements as a result of that. The summary document that you'll find at OPPD Community Connect is one of them. So please don't hesitate to provide that. And
I did. I'm sorry, Jamie. I did want to mention that the summary document. That's a really good point. After each one of these workshops, you need to give us a couple of days to put it together, but we will be putting together kind of a Cliff Note summary version of what was covered in this workshop. We have one up right now of workshop 2, and we will be creating one after this workshop for workshop 3, and that could be a useful document if you wanted to just kind of look at what was covered during this workshop at a glance, or if you have any friends or colleagues that are interested in this but didn't have time to attend a 2-hour workshop, it could be another piece of good information for them to have. So I did want to just put a call out to that document, and that is also available on our website, oppdcommunityconnect.com. Just go to that decarb workshop section, and that's where everything to do with these workshops will be posted and available for you. So sorry to interrupt.
No problem whatsoever.
Get that in.
No problem. So you know you have a variety of ways to give feedback. This will be our last hand raise option. So if you have some comments you wanted to verbalize, if you have the hand raise option to do it now. If not, we are at the end of the presentation and you're free to go, but we're going to stick around to see if you do have some questions. And we're going to talk about, in particular, just any general feedback on the energy portfolio project work. So again, the hand raise button is at the bottom right hand of your screen, or *3 if you're on the phone. Any last thoughts from attendees?
Jamie, before we go to the raised hands, I have a couple of questions in the Q&A that I'd like to get
Great.
to.
Go for it.
Yeah, so one of them, the question is around carbon pricing, and are we modeling, or should we model carbon dividends, and how would that protect low-income customers? And so I wanted to address, that just high level. The energy portfolio modeling work is focused on sort of the energy portfolio, the generation technologies. When we include a carbon price, we're not saying where that necessarily goes. And so I think that's more of a broader policy discussion than this work. So, we would not be considering specific uses of those funds within this work. And I have a couple more, and then I know that you probably have some hand raises there, but there was one around if a lot of different utility companies are also pursuing the same emerging technologies that we are, would we expect the costs to decline, with that? I think what we have today, in response to that, I think what we have today is the best estimate of where those costs are going to be using NREL or the National Renewable Energy Laboratory. Hard to say, but certainly as more utilities invest in those technologies, they could become cheaper. And as part of this decarbonization work, I'm sure there will be a point in time when we can readdress emerging technologies, over time.
Yeah, Colton, I might just add that actually in the cost projections that we do have, embedded in those is an assumption that the industry is scaling up due to other utilities pursuing those same resources. And that industry scale up is the primary driver of the cost reduction. So when we see cost reductions, particularly for things like battery storage or hydrogen, that's driven by demand from other utilities as well.
Thanks, Zach. And I think we have a sensitivity around even taking those NREL costs and taking lower costs around the emerging technologies, just as a sensitivity to see where that would put us. So, we'll see what that might change in terms of the technologies that we might select for that portfolio, but we do have that as an additional sensitivity. We have another question around, we've described it as a heads down modeling effort between the workshop number 4 and workshop number 5. We're not planning on having another workshop, as the team is focusing on the details and we allow them to do their work. But if there are comments that stakeholders would like to provide, throughout the process, OPPD Community Connect is always there, and the team will always be listening. So that's the plan. And then Jamie, do we have any hands raised?
I don't see any. I don't have any. I wanted to check with Sarah or Kim if you can see any that I'm missing.
No, I can't see any. Kim, can you see any that we're missing? Maybe give people a second still if they.
Not at this time. I don't see any.
Colton, do you have any Q&A we haven't yet addressed?
I have one more Q&A in response to Zach's comments around modeling the portfolio self-sufficiency. So we'll be addressing that topic in a lot more depth in the workshop number 4. So I would certainly encourage you to come to workshop number 4 as we address that. But overall, what we'd be looking for is OPPD still having the capacity to meet its energy demand throughout the season, as are our requirements today. There's a lot emerging in the market as far as the topic of ELCC, or effective load carrying capability, based on loss of load. And so we'll be discussing that in that workshop setting. I think that's all.
Okay.
Yeah, there's no more hand raises.
Well, you know how to find us. A variety of ways to contact us, and I think anyone else can chime in, but we really sincerely appreciate all of the engagement from our attendees today. Thanks so much. All right. Take care, everybody.